Hello, my name is Krista Rosado, and today I'm doing a book report on the book that I chose, which was Eruptions That Shook the World by Clive Oppenheimer. I actually requested to be able to choose this book because I was going on a trip to Oregon and I was looking at the volcanoes there, and so it was really cool to be able to choose this book. And the photos in this slide are actually from my trip there. This first one was actually at Newberry Crater. You can see the lava flow right here. All right, so a little bit about the author, Clive Oppenheimer. Clive Oppenheimer is a geoscientist. He is super passionate about volcanoes, and this has led him to create films, documentaries, books, and I think some of the videos I've actually seen in this class have been from him, and he's super animated, and he's a really fun person to listen to, so it was cool to choose a book by him. Clive likes to explore volcanoes, and he's very interested in talking about the whole interaction between humans and the climate and the environment and economics too, and how everything ties in together. So he's a great person to learn more than just the facts, but also how everything has coexisted and interacted. All right, so a little overview about the topic and about this book. It's a very intricate book. It has a lot of different chapters. It talks a lot about history. It talks about the mechanics of volcanoes. It talks about extinctions. It talks about different eruptions that had took place and how they affected the people that were living there and the societies. And it also talks about how it devastated certain regions with famines and dark ages. And it also talks about climate change a lot too in the book, and how volcanoes affect climate change. And at the end of the book, he talks a lot about how we can minimize the risk and how we can all get together and kind of be more educated on this. And I actually was really excited about that chapter because when I was in Oregon, I was like, literally, I think the scientist that was there, he was a geologist, but he was at the Newberry Crater, and he was talking about how it could blow up at any second and we'd all be gone. And I was like, this is so crazy. And in Texas, I don't think we have as much of a fear, even though the climate could still affect us, obviously, and all the changes could affect us all the way down here. However, it's just interesting that everyone's living in Oregon and one day it could just be totally wiped out. So it was very interesting, and I love that he talked about that at the end. A little bit more about this. He also talks a lot about the East African Rift, and he talks about how humans that were there have evolved, and I believe he was talking about the Neanderthals were the ones that could survive in colder temperatures, and I thought that point was very interesting that he brought up. And I think that it's kind of crazy how volcanoes literally are the reason that we are who we are today. Like, the Neanderthals survived, and that's how we're here. So that was a very interesting point that he brought up. He also talks about forensic volcanology, and that's kind of where we can look at rocks and see how much sulfur is in them and kind of, get an idea of how long ago a volcano was and how devastating it was by the amount of sulfur that was in the rocks. He also talks about how climate change can happen because of volcanoes, and that ash cloud can literally cool the climate, and it can bring devastating impacts. And a really interesting point that he also brings up in the book is that the recovery from these eruptions is it's so long, probably longer than any other disaster that could happen. Forest fire, give it 100 years, you have some substantial new trees that are growing, but with a volcano, it takes thousands of years, and he did mention that in the book, that it takes thousands of years. And this was at the beginning of the book. He talked about that there's two different types of volcano eruptions, and one of them is explosive and the other one is effusive. And explosive is more common in subduction zones, and that's where you get those big ash clouds, versus effusive eruptions are more of that flowing lava that just flows out, and it can happen more gradually, and it can be more common. Eruptions that are explosive are usually more rare. And I think that's all for this overview. All right, so my impressions of the book. I liked this book because it was pretty easy to read. I think that for a geoscientist that can kind of write in plain English for us to understand was really cool, because it was not hard to follow. There wasn't any crazy words that I was like, what is this? And the language was pretty straightforward, so that was awesome. The fact that he brings in all of these different aspects of history and the economics and the climate and all these things, and kind of talks about it, how they all interact with each other, is really cool. I do have something that I didn't like about that, which I'll get to probably in the next slide, but that part was awesome. And I think that's what Clive does best from the other things I've seen from him. He talks about the past, present, and future of volcanoes. And so, he talks about the past, he talks about historical things, he talks about the present and, certain things that are likely to happen now and ones that are erupting now currently. He also talks about the future, and he talks about there's real situations that can happen that could basically wipe us out. So it's definitely a reality check reading this book. He has he has an overview of how these issues concerning volcanoes are really complex, because a lot of scientists don't agree about all the ways to approach it, and so that's where things can get a little messy. One of the things I did not like was I was hoping to get that the book would have a mention of the place that I'd visited, which was Newberry Crater, but unfortunately that was not in the book. However, he did talk about Crater Lake, which is another volcano that's in Oregon, and so that was cool to at least see that mentioned. And I kind of was expecting the book, I guess the title, I'll get more into the next slide, it was just a little bit misleading, so that's where I was a little confused. But all right, so this is my review of the book. As you can see, I have my little 5-star review, and I gave him 4 out of 5 stars right there. And the reason for this review is because it was a great book, and I really love his analysis of the impacts of these volcanoes, and I like how he just ties it into everything else that's around us and how volcanoes affect everything, and everything is affected by volcanoes. I do like that he talks about how volcanoes work, because if you're going into the book and you know nothing, it definitely gives a good overview. It talks about the mechanics. It talks about how this comes from the mantle and then it rises up, and he talks about subduction zones and, like I said earlier, effusion and explosive volcanoes. So it's a good little overview there. And yeah, so I guess the reason for the 1-star missing would be because the title, Eruptions That Shook the World, it really made me think the book was going to be more about like a kind of like a list, or talking about all the historical volcanoes that have erupted. So I was kind of excited because I wanted to see if the Newberry Crater was on there and read about it, but this book wasn't quite like that. It was more immersive than that, so it was a little different than what I was expecting. And yeah, that's just, the title's just a little bit confusing there. And so yeah, that's my presentation about the Eruptions That Shook the World by Clive Oppenheimer. And I was definitely excited to read it, and it was cool to go on that trip and talk to the geologist there, and then to read the book, and then hear what Clive had to say. And yeah, so thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Thank you.